After Mark tearfully tells Ragabi about his vision of Gemma, Ragabi reassures him that the two of them will be reunited. That reunion may be a little more complicated than expected though, since Mark confesses to Helly that he had sex with Helena. Because while Helly does have conflicting feelings about this news, she mostly feels like Helena stole an experience from her. So she decides to create her own such memory and initiates having sex with Mark in an unused room on the severed floor. But since Mark's reintegration procedure is still affecting his mind, his nose begins to bleed shortly afterwards, which leads to a medical check performed by Miss Wong. And I wonder if Miss Wong is going to catch on to Mark's reintegration, because even though she may only be in a fellowship with Lumen, whatever that means, she does strike me as a particularly smart cookie. So while Milchick takes the time to address the infractions in his performance review, Miss Wong may come to learn a bit more about the MDR team. Though I'm still interested in seeing how Milchick's personality is going to change moving forward, since he did have an intense moment to himself in the mirror. Meanwhile, Dylan gets to spend more time with his Audi's wife Gretchen, and the interaction they share in the Audi visitation suite is juxtaposed beautifully against the interaction they have in the real world. Because while Gretchen seems to get along perfectly well with Dylan's innie, her relationship with Dylan's Audi seems to have some issues. To the point where having a happy and loving conversation with his innie, which is punctuated perfectly with a particularly passionate kiss, almost feels like Gretchen is cheating on Audi Dylan, especially since she lies to him about the interaction even taking place. But is it even possible for Gretchen to cheat on Dylan with himself? I mean, it's possible that innie Dylan just reminds Gretchen of the way Audi Dylan used to be, but it's also entirely possible that innie Dylan is way more loving and caring than Audi Dylan ever was. And that brings me to the fascinating dinner conversation between Irving Burt and his husband Fields. Because Irving asks Burt about why he decided to sever himself at Lumen in the first place, and Burt responds by saying that he was compelled by the word of Jesus Christ. Apparently, a pastor at Bert's former church declared that innies and outies do have separate souls, and since he believed that his own soul was damned, he severed himself with the hopes that his innie soul would get into heaven. And I don't know about you, but I think that is an incredibly interesting topic of conversation. I don't believe that the Catholic Church would believe in the idea of two souls existing in one body, but I think it's actually true within the context of this show. I mean, it would explain how Mark could have sex with Helena and Heliar, despite the fact that they are the same person. How Gretchen could feel one way about innie Dylan without feeling the exact same way about outie Dylan, and how Burt can have a loving relationship with one man despite being married to another. Luckily for Burt, Field seems to honestly believe that innies deserve to experience love, which is why he drunkenly blurts out that he wouldn't be mad to learn if Burt and Irving had unprotected sex together. Which, I mean, good for you, Fields. That's a very nice and progressive stand for you to take. Unfortunately, Fields also admits that Burt has been with Lumen for 20 years, despite the fact that the severance procedure was only invented 12 years ago. So the show is probably trying to imply that Burt is supposed to be a Lumen bigwig of sorts, and that would fucking suck. Because I already don't trust over half of the characters in this show, so not being able to trust Burt would definitely feel rather heartbreaking, especially since I was hoping for Burt and Irving to end up together. But I'm pretty sure Irving is part of some sort of Lumen resistance, which is why he keeps making secret phone calls, and why he has a directory of Lumen employees hidden at his house. but Bert never asked Irving why he chose to join Lumen in the first place, so the exact details of his past still happen to be a mystery to us. Either way, I think it's clear that the show is destined to end in heartbreak and tragedy, right? Because there's no way that Irving and Bert are going to end up together, or that Gretchen is going to find happiness in both Innie Dillon and Outie Dillon, or that Mark is going to somehow end up with both Helly and Gemma. Speaking of which, Ragabi tells Mark that they need to accelerate the reintegration process by surgically flooding his Severance chip, which, sounds like a pretty normal step in the process, until you realize that Mark has a gaping hole in the back of his head. That's just absolutely disgusting. I thought the tease in the opening credits sequence was meant to be metaphorical, not literal, but Mark refuses the procedure and storms out of the house, and who does he run into? Why, none other than Helena, of course. So she introduces herself to him, and the two start having an oddly flirtatious conversation. Which is weird because I seriously don't understand why Helena seems to be so interested with Mark to begin with, but also because Mark admits that he already knows who Helena Egan is. So why does he not find this entire encounter to be weird? This is only a few days after the OTC, after all, where he discovered that his neighbor was actually his boss who had come to spy on him. I wouldn't consider any random encounter I had with a Lumen employee to be purely coincidental. But Mark does eventually become uneasy and leaves to return home, deciding that he will proceed with surgically expediting his reintegration after all. So Ragabi reopens the disgusting incision in Mark's skull and injects a fluid into the region of his brain containing the chip. Mark then experiences flashes of having sex with Helly, which definitely causes him to freak out. And even though Ragabi warns him to keep his head still, Mark rushes to the door once he hears Devin knocking, which quickly causes him to become disoriented and to collapse right onto the floor. So if we want to see how this will affect Mark's personality moving forward, if it does at all, we'll just have to tune into the next exciting episode of Severance. But until then, I have to admit that I really liked how this episode was filled with plenty of moral and philosophical debates. Debates that probably would take place if Severance were actually a real-world procedure. Because the very concept of severance inherently raises several interesting ethical questions, so I like how the show finally took the time to address some of those questions from within the actual narrative itself. It just made for a really captivating episode in my opinion. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing the next episode of Severance once it gets released on Friday.